Trudeau announces Canada's first representative to combat Islamophobia. This is the Great White North Report.
I'm in love with the system, never going home. I'm in love.
So on January 26, Trudeau announces Amira Elghawaby as Canada's first representative to combat Islamophobia. Because no one in our country should experience hatred because of their faith, Trudeau says. I think this is just a waste of money, giving somebody a post that didn't exist before. And why Islamophobia? We don't have a special Jewish representative or a special Christian representative, or the indigenous cultures don't have special representatives for their religions. The Shintos, the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Taoists, the atheists, they don't have special representation. Why Islam? And what is Trudeau's game? Well, first of all, for me, I've known many Muslims over the years, and I've worked with many Muslims. For the most part, I've had no problems. Some of them I would consider friendly, but I do understand I don't like Islam, if that makes sense. There is a distinction. Many Muslims are very admirable people, but I think Islam screws them up, because for me, Islam is a political system with the trappings of a religion. The Catholic Church at one time had that problem, not so much anymore. In Islam, there's no separation between church and state, and that's where Islam needs to reform itself, especially here in the West, because we are different in the West than they are in the East. I think Trudeau is doing this to drive a wedge and force the Conservatives by calling them racist and Islamophobic. And Trudeau is trying to get the Muslim vote. Even though most Muslims are actually not liberal, they're very far-right conservative, very much so. But the Liberals tend to give more money out to minority groups in Canada. So Trudeau is standing by this appointment, even though Quebec is really angry at it. Amira linked Quebec's Bill 21 to anti-Muslim sentiment because it bans certain government employees from wearing religious symbols at work. Well, it's true. If you wear religious symbols at work, they're banned. You don't wear them. So that's the hijab, because there are no real religious symbols for men in Islam. Only women, and the hijab is not really a religious symbol. They made it into that because it's compulsory under Sharia law, so women don't get raped in Muslim countries. It hides their beauty. That's the whole idea of it. But here we don't need that. And it's also true that Catholics can't wear a cross. I don't know how Sikhs would do it with their turban, because you don't hear the Sikhs complaining. Now, she has also in the past been highly critical of Canada, calling it a dominant European Judeo-Christian storytelling. What do you expect? Europeans founded Canada with help from the indigenous people. There were no Muslims here in the 18th century and 19th century. They weren't cutting down the trees and clearing the land and building villages, building homes, villages, towns, and cities. Islam is a late newcomer to this country. She demands Muslim prayer rooms in schools, which is, you don't need it. Why do you demand a prayer room? Other religions don't demand a prayer room. In fact, they've taken Christianity out of schools. We used to have a Christian. Once a week, the pastor would come to my public school and preach for like a half an hour, like tell stories and stuff like that from the Bible. Now they don't do that. In the Catholic schools, they do have a chapel, but that's the Catholic school. It's for Catholics. But many Muslims go to the Catholic school. Because why? Because it's better education. There's more money in the Catholic school board than there is in the public school board. And now they're demanding prayer rooms. You don't need a prayer room. You can go outside. You can go to a classroom. All you have to do is face east. Cell phone will do that for you. They have a special app, so they know which way to face is Mecca. Though they really should be facing Petra. Because in the early days of Islam, under the Umayyads, all the mosques, their qiblas faced Petra. It wasn't until the Abbasids took over that the qibla started shifting down to Mecca. It's a political statement. She also voiced comments highly critical of the late Queen, calling her racist along with a call to disarm and defund the police. Oh, that works well. Disarm and defund the police. Calling the Queen her racist. Really, she's racist. The British Empire is racist. They are the ones who got rid of slavery, which in Islam, slavery is okay. It's part of Sharia law. There's a whole section in Sharia law on slaves. Muslims were the middlemen in the whole slave trade. People talk about the Western slave trade, but they forget about the East African slave trade, or the white slave trade in North Africa. So this lady is not the best person, but it's a political move by Trudeau. But for me, Islam is not compatible with Western society. Like I said, it's more of a political system. For example, Islam is very anti-LGBTQ. Western University removes LGBTQ social media post after backlash from the Muslim community in London. Because, why? Because it showed two women in hijabs kissing. We got a white guy, we got a black guy, we got someone from India, someone from somewhere else. My apologies on that. A handicapped person, another white person. Well, but we can't have Muslims showing being LGBTQ because that's haram. Forbidden under Sharia. So they're very anti-LGBTQ. In fact, in most Muslim countries, it's either a death sentence or it's a long prison term. It's also anti-feminist. The hijab is pretty much compulsory. Also under Sharia law, the word of one man is worth that of two women. So if two women say no and the man says yes, the yes vote wins because he breaks all ties. You need three women to say no and the man says yes before the women would win in a court of law. Also in rape cases, if a woman gets raped, four men have to witness it. Come forward as witnesses. How often are you going to find four men to witness a rape? That's why rape is so unreported in Islam. Because it's so hard to find witnesses. Because you got to find four guys who witnessed it. It's a huge problem. In many countries like Afghanistan now, Saudi Arabia, they finally started opening it up, but women could not go to university. Many Muslim countries are still the same. Women are not allowed higher education. Sharia law, men are allowed to have 4 wives. And it happens in Canada. That case where the Afghanistan family, the father and the second wife, killed his 3 daughters and his first wife by killing them and then putting them in a car and driving it into the canal to make it look like an accident. That happened in Kingston. There are many traditional Muslim men here in Canada that probably have 2 wives, just hidden. Another reason why Islam is incompatible with our society is that they are very anti-free speech. This art professor in the United States was fired from Minnesota University for showing a 14th century painting of Islam's founder Muhammad. Today's Islam, it's not okay to show the face of Muhammad. It's okay to show God and everyone else, but not Muhammad. In other words, they put Muhammad above God. So you're not allowed to show Muhammad's face. But back in the 14th century, it's perfectly acceptable to do so. Muslim artists did so in the 14th century. This university professor, she had a class on medieval art. She was doing it in the Muslim period. In her syllabus, she told Muslim students, gave a warning, that if you're offended by this, do not show up. Of course, what happened? A Muslim student showed up, happened to be the president of the Muslim Association, and then as soon as she saw it, she went right to the head of the university and demanded that professor get fired, which happened. Even though they had full warning and they knew what was going to happen. Freedom of speech automatically destroyed because they couldn't handle it. Just like Charlie Hebdo, who makes satirical fun of Islam. Salman Rushdie, who did a satirical satanic verse, which was actually a book of fiction based on a couple of things. UK Muslims vent anger over desecration of the Holy Quran because somebody ripped some pages out of it. Things like that. But in reality, Uthman burned the Quran and Abu Bakr burned the Hadith. Why? They get such an uproar over the desecration of the Quran, but meanwhile, Uthman, from the Umayyad period, he burned the Quran because there were so many Qurans at the time that they didn't know which was the real one, so Uthman ordered Zayd bin Thabit to rewrite the manuscripts in perfect copies. And then once they were done, they threw out 98% of what they had and only kept 2%. And the rest were burned, destroyed supposedly. The problem is we don't have an Uthmanic Quran today. What we have there are hundreds of Qurans probably, but there are 30 main ones. 10 readers and 20 transmitters. The readers are schools of thought. And the transmitters are their students. Because in 1924 in Cairo, university students, or was it high school? One of the two. They're having problems because for questions about the Quran and what's in it, they were getting too many different responses because there's so many different Qurans. So they decided to standardize it in 1924 Cairo. They did so and they chose Hafs Quran. Why? Because it was the most popular at the time, not because it's the most accurate. Hafs was not well regarded by his contemporaries like al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. So they chose the Hafs Quran and then they threw everything else in the Nile. The government destroyed a large number of such texts, singing them into the Nile and issued its own text. So so what they're reading today, most Muslims, I think 95% read the Hafs Quran, 5% read Warsh in North Africa is the main one. Saudi Arabia destroys 98% of its cultural heritage. They do this because Wahhabism, which I think is the prevailing Saudi strain of Islam, disapproves of visits to religio-historical sites in order to prevent Islam's gravest sin, worshipping anyone other than God. Idolatry. And they also destroy non-Islamic things. ISIS and the Taliban were great for that. So you see, Islam does not allow freedom of speech. When it comes to things, there's the holes in the narrative, the standard Islamic narrative. Is that what we're going to teach our kids in school? The standard Islamic narrative? She's talking about this Amira. She's talking about how highly critical of Canada, calling it dominant European Judeo-Christian storytelling, when the standard Islamic narrative is the same thing, and there are gaping holes in that narrative. Dr. Yasser Qadi did an interview with this Muslim YouTuber in the UK, and they had a discussion, and a lot of things came out, and a lot of Muslims today around the world are leaving Islam because of it. Another thing you have to look at is Sharia law. I've mentioned this before. Reliance of the Traveler is probably the most influential Sharia law manual. It was written in the 14th century, and it is still held today as fiqh, meaning it's authoritative summation of Islamic jurisprudence. Sharia. It is by no means a relevant or outdated document for Muslim followers of Sharia once a consensus of scholars rules on a matter is no longer subject for debate. So there's no debating. It's already been ruled upon by guys long dead. So it's endorsed by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who supplied the leadership for Al-Qaeda and many other jihadist groups. These are all the countries that use Sharia law. State level, mainly Sharia: Libya, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen. All the Muslim countries use this. Sharia is those who follow Muhammad are ruthless to the unbelievers but merciful to one another. Quran 48:29. Unbelievers are Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, and others. Kafirs. Islam always distinguishes between Muslims and non-Muslims. It's non-inclusive. It's also compulsion. If a non-Muslim marries a Muslim, that non-Muslim has to convert. So if a Christian man marries a Islamic woman, which happened to a buddy of mine, he had to convert. Their kids are automatically Muslim. If someone who's born Muslim tries to leave Islam, it can be apostasy and is also a death penalty in many Muslim countries. Do not murder. Sharia exceptions: murdering an apostate deserter of Islam, which I just said. A parent murdering his or her children or his or her children's children. The later exception applies to honor murders. Do not commit adultery. Sharia exceptions: sex with multiple wives, sex with slaves and captives, and sex with temporary wives. Meaning you can make a contract with a woman for an hour to be your wife. You can have an hour wife. It's just a legalized form of prostitution. Do not steal. Sharia exceptions: forcible seizure, snatching and running, and theft by betraying a trust. Corruption is rampant in Islamic states due to these exceptions. Do not bear false witness. It's okay to break the intent of an oath as long as you don't break the letter of the oath. When it's possible to achieve such a name by lying, but by not telling the truth, it's permissible to lie if attaining the goal is permissible. Examples include protecting Islam or a Muslim, so it's called taqiyya. It is perfectly acceptable for Muslims to lie to non-believers. Blasphemy. Insulting Islam or Muhammad. A Muslim is considered an apostate, subject to being killed by anyone for being sarcastic about the Quran, any part of Islam, or any ruling of Sharia law, or any of Allah's messengers. Which goes back to the freedom of speech. Female inequality, wife beating, happens a lot. It's perfectly acceptable. There's also a chapter on commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. In Muslim countries, this gives a Muslim the right to go into a non-believer's house if they think they are doing something wrong and correcting it physically. That's disturbing to bring that here in our country. Slavery is permissible. Pedophilia is another big thing. It is perfectly acceptable and fine to marry someone as young as 8 years old. Do we really want to bring that here? Many Muslim countries, non-believers have to pay a tax for protection, the jizya. So for Muslims to call us Islamophobic, there's good reason to fear Islam. So when it comes to Sharia law, the National Assembly of Quebec passed a motion to prevent the use of Islamic courts in Quebec. Ontario kind of has that. The province of Ontario, and back in 2006, banned all forms of faith-based arbitrations. So they banned Sharia law, but they also banned rabbinical courts, which was criticized by Canadian Jewish groups. But, if you're going to ban Sharia, you got to ban that too as well. Now, back in 2017, Trudeau tried to get an Islamophobia legislation passed. And the problem with this is that there's hate speech for sure. But there's also criticism, and that is the most important factor. Islam does not like criticism. They don't like historical criticism. They don't like literary criticism because they have a hard time. The standard Islamic narrative has a hard time standing up to that because there are a lot of things to criticize about Islam. Among most of the major religions, I think there's a lot. And Islam calls attention to itself. How many Hindu terrorist groups are there out there in the world being orchestrated in many countries? The same with Buddhism, Christianity, Taoism, Shintoism, all the other religions of the world. How many of them actually have terrorist groups that operate internationally? We have Al-Qaeda, we have ISIS, we have Boko Haram, Hezbollah, Hamas, Abu Sayyaf, the MILF, Mindanao Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF for short. These are all dangerous groups. The only thing we have in Christianity that comes close would be the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. But that was just in the United States, and it's now more or less not a thing anymore. It's still around, but not like it was. The NRA, the National Republican Army in Ireland, that's a totally different can of worms. That's nationalism. So we don't have that same type of movements. And all of these groups base themselves on Islamic law, Sharia law. Islamophobia is just another way to stifle criticism of Islam and free speech. One of the other problems we have with Islam is the law of abrogation. When you look at the Quran, Islam teaches that the Quran there are some verses that abrogate or cancel out other verses. Certain verses are rendered null and void by later verses because there are many contradictions within the Quran. One Quran will say accept Christians and Jews, but the other verse will say kill Christians and Jews. Muslims do not consider these abrogations as contradictions by their God. They seem instead they are improvements to changing circumstances. Well, they haven't changed those circumstances since then. In the Hafs Quran, here are the 114 verses. There are couple of Qurans that have more verses. Now, these verses are not in any chronological order in the Quran. It's not a chronological book. It's actually based on the length of the verse, with the exception of the first verse, which is kind of like a preface. But all the other verses are based on how long they are. So you go from the longest to the shortest. The ones in yellow are from the Meccan period, where Muhammad first started out in Mecca, when he got the first revelation. And then the ones in orange are from Medina, when he was forced into exile from Mecca and went up to Medina. The Meccan verses are the peaceful verses. The Medina verses are the violent verses that call for the extermination of Jews and Christians and other non-believers. A Meccan verse can say that accepts other religions as well as Christians and Jews, but then you have a Medina verse, a later verse that tells you to kill them all or subjugate them. So these orange verses will cancel anything that contradicts it in an earlier verse. That's abrogation. It's a very important distinction. They'll try and downplay it because they don't see the problem, or they refuse to admit the problem. The Meccan verses are when Muhammad, if he was really in Mecca, there's a lot of debate, historical debate on that, had very few followers and was trying to attract followers, so he was basically promising everything. But then he moves to Medina and he starts raiding caravans. He steals and he kills people. And he takes all his money and he attracts followers because, hey, the more successful he was as a caravan raider, the more followers he got because, hey, everyone wants loot, wants to get money for, it's like being in the mafia. So he attracted more followers because the more powerful he got. And then the more he did not take criticism well. There are stories in the hadiths, in the siras, where he has people killed who criticize him. So that is a dangerous thing. This is why Islam does not like criticism. So for me, I would say that Islam needs a reformation. Kind of like what Christianity had back in the 16th century with Martin Luther. Was it a perfect reformation? No. The Catholic Church split up into many splinter groups. You still have the Catholic Church, but you had all these splinter religions that now compete against each other. But it did help separate church and state. Unfortunately, moderate Muslims who would like to reform Islam are in a minority. And I think that Muslims in the Western world, in Canada, have a chance to wean themselves away from the more violent Islamic brands that come out of their homelands, their original homelands. Or will they continue to practice taqiyya on us? So I would like to call for the Islamic world here in Canada and the United States to reform itself, have a reformation, rewrite the Quran, taking out all the violent passages, practicing the peaceful elements of what Islam is supposed to be. allowing critical thought. But again, like I said, from an historical and literary point of view, Islam cannot stand up to criticism. It will not stand up to historical criticism. It cannot stand up to literary criticism. The Bible has been through these things, by the way. So is the Torah. So I know that since I started making this video, the Amira, she apologized for past comments about Quebecers. That's just a political move. That's her practicing tequila on us. She doesn't mean it. She means what she said back in 2019 because there's been an uproar over her appointment. She's not sorry. She's just doing it. It's politics. Trudeau is playing a political game that could hurt Canadians. Not now, not 20 years from now, but maybe 50 years from now, it could hurt us. Is that hate speech for me? No. But some might construe my words as hate speech. I would rather call on Muslims in Canada to reform themselves and learn something about their religion. Do that deep dive that Dr. Yasser Qadi was talking about to find out what really happened. Because let's face it, you don't hear the Mennonites complain. And in my area, Mennonites get there's a lot of hate speech towards what would be considered hate speech towards Mennonites in this area, in the area I'm in. The Amish, they don't complain. But Islam wants to be separate from everyone else. They want special privileges, treated no special than anyone else. But anyway, any Canadians out there, let me know what you guys think of the whole Islamophobia. And is Trudeau going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Leave comments in the comment section. Until next time, this has been the Great White North Report.
I'm in love with the